Important are the flooded continental shelves. And that's why Santa and I spent 7 years of our lives scuba diving all around the world.
As the water levels change, some of those ancient cities could be completely covered.
In 2001, a sonar sweep off the coast of Cuba returned an image that should have rewritten human history. Pyramids, right angles, roads, half a mile beneath the Caribbean. The discovery hit National Geographic, Reuters, The Washington Post.
There's stuff strewn all over the place. They described it as massive blocks that were strewn all over the ocean floor.
A follow-up expedition went out. A documentary aired. And then, almost overnight, every researcher who had spoken on the record went silent. The site has not been rescanned in 25 years. Not by Cuba, not by any major institution. The reason is not lost funding, and it is not politics. The reason is much, much worse. The survey that found too much. The ship was looking for shipwrecks. That is the first thing to understand. Advanced digital communications. The small Canadian-Cuban exploration company, Zalitsky, ran with her partner Paul Weinzweig, had a contract with the Cuban government to map the seabed for Spanish galleons. Colonial-era wrecks, gold and silver bound for the Spanish treasury. Routine deep ocean survey work, nothing more. What came back on the sonar that night was not a galleon.
Tamil fishermen and Tamil divers and see if they'd seen any weird stuff underwater, which they certainly had.
At approximately 2,200 feet down, on a flat plateau extending from the Cuban continental shelf off the Guanahacobibe's peninsula, the equipment returned a series of images of geometric stone structures. Pyramids, rectangular buildings, what looked like roads, circular features. Seen from above, the arrangement looked less like geology and more like the aerial layout of a city. But here is the thing. Zalitsky was not a treasure hunter or a true believer. She was a Soviet-trained ocean engineer who had worked on submarine systems during the Cold War. She had spent her entire career staring at sonar returns. She knew what natural seafloor looked like. She knew what artificial structure looked like. And when her team sat down with the printouts the next morning, she said it out loud in front of her crew. Geometric, architectural, designed. The discovery hit international news within months. National Geographic ran it. Reuters ran it. The Washington Post ran it. The Cuban government confirmed the sonar imagery was real. A return expedition was scheduled for 2002. The footage was promised to National Geographic Television for a documentary. And then, almost without explanation, the entire project went dark. The woman who ruled it out. To understand why the silence matters, you have to understand who Zalitsky was.
Magical in diving on an underwater city.
She was not somebody chasing fame. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, she immigrated to Canada and built advanced digital communications with Weinzweig from scratch. The company specialized in deep ocean survey work, the kind of precise technical mapping that oil companies, telecommunications firms, and governments pay serious money for. Military-grade side-scan sonar, adapted for commercial use, real equipment. And here is what most people miss. When the geometric anomalies first appeared in the data, she did not announce them. She did not call a press conference. She ran the sonar again and again. She compared the returns to known geological formations. Volcanic pillars, sediment terraces, beach rock. Nothing matched. The shapes were too consistent. Right angles, repeated. Linear features connecting the larger forms, like roads connecting buildings. The anomalies covered an area that ranged from several hundred meters to several kilometers across, depending on where the boundaries were drawn. Now, here is the deal. Natural underwater formations can produce strange shapes. Volcanic activity creates pillars. Sediment flows produce linear features. Zalitsky knew this. She had seen all of it. So when she finally stated her conclusion, carefully but firmly, it was not because she wanted attention. It was because she had ruled everything else out. The sonar had detected something artificial. That was her professional judgment. And then she handed the data to the Cuban government and waited for the follow-up expedition that would settle the question forever. It did not settle anything. It made everything worse. The footage they never released. The Cuban government did not suppress the story. That is the part most people get wrong. They embraced it. the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment assigned researchers to the project. They brought in Manuel Iturralde Vinent, a senior geologist at Cuba's Natural History Museum and one of the most respected earth scientists on the island, to review the findings. Iturralde Vinent looked at the sonar data and did not laugh. He sat with it for days. He acknowledged that the images showed unusual formations that warranted further investigation. He noted that the geology of western Cuba was complex, that the region sits near a tectonic boundary where multiple plates interact, and that unusual subsidence events were at least theoretically possible. He did not endorse the underwater city interpretation. He did not reject it either. He called for more data. That was the careful, professional, scientifically honest answer. But here's the thing. More data meant going down there. 2,200 feet of black water. The 2002 follow-up expedition deployed a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV capable of diving to those depths. This was the moment of truth. Sonar can be ambiguous.
We know that it's been underwater for about 6,000 or 7,000 years, but the question is, how long before that was it made? How long did it stand there above water?
Direct visual confirmation would settle the question once and for all. The expedition reached the site. The ROV descended into the dark, and the footage it captured has never been fully released. What has been shown publicly in the 2003 National Geographic documentary and in a handful of clips that have circulated since shows murky, dark water imagery of large, stone-like forms. Visibility was poor, the lighting was limited, the shapes are massive but indistinct. Zalitsky and Weinzweig, reviewing the footage afterward, maintained that it confirmed their original interpretation. They described pyramidal structures, carved blocks, evidence of artificial construction. But what was released to the public was not conclusive enough to settle the scientific debate. What was needed was a more extensive expedition. Better cameras, more dive time, multiple angles, maybe even physical samples that could be analyzed for tool marks. That expedition never happened. If the questions being asked here are the kind of questions you actually want answered, do something simple right now. Subscribe and turn the bell on. Because what comes next is the part nobody who was on that 2002 boat will talk about anymore. 25 years of silence had to start somewhere. It started here, the interviews that stopped. For about 2 years, Zalitsky and Weinzweig kept talking. Through 2003 and into 2004, they gave interviews. They expressed continued confidence in the discovery. They spoke of plans for additional expeditions and partnerships with international research institutions. Then Zalitsky stopped answering the phone. That is not metaphor. Researchers who tried to follow up with her after 2004 described the same experience. Calls not returned, emails ignored, conference invitations declined. The woman who had been the public face of the discovery simply walked away from the conversation. Advanced digital communications went quiet too. Its website, which had once featured detailed information about the Cuba project, was eventually taken down. The Cuban government, which had initially been enthusiastic, stopped issuing statements. The Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment did not announce any follow-up research. Iturralde Vinent continued his career, but rarely discussed the underwater structures in public again. International archaeological institutions that had expressed initial interest declined to fund expeditions. The major oceanographic research organizations, Woods Hole, Scripps, the National Oceanographic Agencies, did not add the Cuba site to their research agendas. Within a few years, the Cuban underwater pyramids had effectively vanished from serious scientific discussion. Not debunked, not explained, just abandoned. The silence has now lasted 25 years. And what comes next is the reason why. The depth problem. The structures sit at approximately 600 to 750 meters below the current sea surface. That is the number that broke the project. That is the number that made everyone walk away. Here is why. For the structures to be artificial, they would have had to be built on dry land or in shallow water. Humans do not build cities at the bottom of the ocean. So either the sea level was once dramatically lower at this location, or the land itself dropped after construction. Now, here is the problem. Neither scenario fits comfortably within established scientific understanding. The last time global sea levels were significantly lower was during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. approximately 20,000 to 26,000 years ago. At that time, massive ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, locking up enormous quantities of water and lowering sea levels worldwide by approximately 120 to 130 meters. But 130 meters is not 600 meters. Even at the absolute lowest point of the Ice Age, the Cuba site would still have been hundreds of meters underwater. For these structures to have been built at sea level, you would have to push the timeline back to a period so ancient that any builders would predate everything currently known about human prehistory by tens of thousands of years. The alternative explanation is tectonic. Western Cuba sits in an active zone where the Caribbean plate, the North American plate, and several smaller microplates interact. But the scale of subsidence required is extraordinary. For a landmass to drop from sea level to 600 meters below the surface, you would need a catastrophic tectonic event or sustained subsidence at rates far beyond anything documented in the Caribbean record. Iturralde Vinen acknowledged this directly. He noted that, while unusual tectonic events were theoretically possible, the evidence for one in western Cuba was not strong. The site is too deep for Ice Age sea level, too deep for documented tectonics, too deep for any timeline that fits inside known human history. This is why the scientific establishment walked away. If the structures were artificial, they implied a human history that contradicted everything archaeologists and geologists believed. If the structures were natural, they were not worth the enormous expense of deep ocean research. Faced with that choice, the scientific community chose neither. It chose silence, the shadow of Bimini. There was another reason researchers walked away, and it has a name. In 1968, divers off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas discovered what appeared to be a paved road on the shallow sea floor. Large, roughly rectangular stone blocks, arranged in a linear pattern, extending for approximately half a mile. Some researchers argued it was evidence of a lost civilization. Others argued the formation was natural beach rock that had cracked into rectangular shapes. The debate has never been resolved. The Cuba site sits in the same waters, the same zone of Caribbean mystery. When the discovery was announced in 2001, comparisons to Bimini were immediate. Some researchers suggested the Cuba structures in the Bimini Road might be remnants of the same lost civilization, submerged at different depths by the same catastrophic events. Others saw the comparison as damning. Adding another ambiguous underwater formation to the pile would only fuel fringe theories without producing scientific progress. But here is the thing. The Bimini comparison was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the other word, Atlantis. Plato's account, the earliest written source for the legend, placed the lost civilization in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Caribbean fits the broad parameters of Plato's description better than many other proposed locations. When the Cuba discovery was announced, Atlantis speculation exploded across the internet, in tabloids, in television specials. Mainstream archaeology has spent decades distancing itself from Atlantis claims, which have been used to justify countless pseudo-archaeological theories. Serious researchers avoid the association as a matter of professional survival. So, when the Cuba site got tangled up with Atlantis, the door closed. Not because the data was bad, because the company it was now keeping made the data untouchable. What the footage shows. The few researchers who have continued to investigate the Cuba site over the past 25 years have done so quietly, without institutional support, and largely without public attention. The depth makes exploration extraordinarily expensive. The location adds political complications. Funding is nearly impossible to secure. What they have pieced together from the limited data is troubling. The original sonar images, reanalyzed with modern software, continue to show geometric regularity that is difficult to explain through natural processes. The angles are too consistent. The arrangements are too organized. The overall pattern looks less like random geology and more like deliberate design. Now, here is the deal. The 2002 ROV footage, examined frame by independent researchers, shows details that were not emphasized in the original documentary coverage. Some claim to see carved surfaces, fitted blocks, architectural features that would be impossible to produce through natural erosion. the depth problem remains unresolved. But some researchers have begun to question whether the standard models of Caribbean tectonics are complete. Major events in the prehistoric past might have left evidence that has not yet been recognized. None of this is proof. None of it has been published in peer-reviewed journals. But the questions have not gone away. The silence of the witnesses. Here is what Zalitsky has not done in 25 years. She has not given an interview about the site. She has not published follow-up research. She has not responded to inquiries from researchers who have tried to reach her. The woman who once stood in front of cameras and said the word architectural has not stood in front of a camera about Cuba since. Weinzweig has occasionally surfaced, brief interviews, sparse details. He confirms his continued belief in the discovery, but does not offer new information. He has hinted that political complications, tensions between Cuba and the United States, and difficulties with international research partnerships played a role in ending the project. He has not provided a detailed explanation. He has not named the actors involved. He has been careful. The Cuban government's silence is just as striking. In 2001, Cuban officials were enthusiastic. They saw potential for international attention, scientific prestige, possibly tourism revenue. They assigned researchers. They facilitated the follow-up expedition. Then they too went quiet. No official Cuban scientific institution has published research on the site since the early 2000s. The discovery has been effectively erased from Cuba's official scientific agenda. What changed? Some researchers have speculated that the Cuban government received pressure from international scientific institutions, from political actors, from sources that have never been identified, to drop the project. Others have suggested that the follow-up expedition found something that all parties agreed should not be publicized, something that confirmed artificial construction, something that raised questions nobody was prepared to answer. These are speculations. There is no documentary evidence. The people who know what actually happened have chosen not to speak. That choice is now 25 years old. Why? The depth is the reason. Here is where the story gets worse, much worse than most people realize. The depth of the Cuba structures is not just a scientific problem, it is an existential one. If the structures are artificial, they imply one of two possibilities, both catastrophic for established understandings of human history. The first is that human civilization is far older than currently believed, tens of thousands of years older. For the Cuba site to have been built at sea level and then submerged through sea level rise alone, construction would have had to occur at a time so ancient that it predates every known human civilization. Anatomically modern humans would have developed complex urban architectural societies far earlier than any current evidence suggests. Everything in the textbooks gets rewritten. The second is that catastrophic tectonic events can occur on scales not currently recognized by geology. For the Cuba site to have been built at sea level and then dropped to its current depth, the land would have had to sink hundreds of meters in a geologically brief period. The geological models used to understand earthquake risk, coastal stability, and tectonic hazards would be fundamentally incomplete. The first undermines archaeology, the second undermines geology, and both raise the specter of Atlantis, not as a literal place from Greek mythology, but as a category of event, sudden, catastrophic destruction of a civilization, sunk beneath the waves, lost. If it happened once, it could happen again. This is the deepest reason for the silence. The Cuba discovery is not just an archaeological puzzle, it is a challenge to the stability of the present. If human civilizations can be submerged and lost, if the land itself can drop without warning, then the coastal cities of the modern world are built on foundations that may not be as stable as anyone wants to believe. Miami, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, Mumbai. All of them sit at sea level. All of them depend on geological models that the Cuba discovery, if confirmed, would call into question. The implications are not academic. They are insurance actuarial. They are zoning code. They are evacuation planning. And the scientific establishment may have recognized in 2001 that some questions are better left unanswered. The structures still wait. For 25 years, the most intriguing underwater discovery of the 21st century has sat untouched at a depth that makes casual exploration impossible. The equipment necessary to properly survey the site exists. The technology has improved dramatically since 2001. Modern remotely operated vehicles could capture footage of far higher quality than anything obtained in 2002. Nobody has gone back. The cost would be substantial. The political complications remain. The scientific establishment's reluctance to engage with the site has not diminished, and so the structures wait. Whatever they are, natural formations or artificial constructions produced by a civilization that should not exist, they sit in darkness, half a mile below the Caribbean surface. Documented once, then abandoned. The silence is the story now. 25 years of not looking, 25 years of not asking, 25 years of letting the most controversial sonar images in underwater archaeology fade from public attention. If the structures are natural, the silence is merely negligent. But if the structures are artificial, the silence is something else. It is the deliberate avoidance of a discovery that would overturn fundamental assumptions about human history, geological stability, and the vulnerability of coastal civilizations. It is the choice not to know. Paulina Zalitsky still has the data. The footage from 2002 still exists. The coordinates are known. The technology has improved. All that is missing is the will. And the will has been absent for a quarter of a century. So the question becomes simple. Was this silence accidental? The slow drift of underfunded science, losing interest in an inconvenient site? Or was it deliberate, a quiet agreement between the people who saw the footage that the world was not ready for the answer? Drop the theory you find most convincing in the comments. And if there is one specific underwater anomaly, on any coast, in any ocean, that has been buried by official silence for too long, name it below. The next investigation on this channel could be the one that finally drags it back into the light.